patrol with critical vehicle function.
Welcome to Future Thinking episode 114. My name is Alexander Schatten. This is again an English episode. Stay tuned for more German episodes in the future. This is the second episode covering the Liberty in Our Lifetime Conference 2024. If you have not listened to part 1, I would recommend to start there. Please at least check out the intro. In part 2, I will share with you my conversations with Razavi, who is building an online country for digital nomads, Grant Romundt, who will explain his idea of floating homes, and finally Peter Young from the Free Cities Foundation. This conversation was recorded at the end of the conference to reflect Free Cities as well as the conference. If you like this podcast, please support it. This podcast is free and without advertisement, so you can help by sharing it with colleagues, friends, family, liking and posting on social networks and the like. Now, without further ado, let's jump into the conversation with Lauren Razavi. Lauren, thank you very much for taking time.
No problem. Thank you for asking.
Maybe you could start with you introducing yourself briefly.
So my name is Lauren Razavi, and I am Executive Director of Plumia, which is a think tank focused on global mobility. I am also author of a book called Global Natives about the past, present, and future of borderless work.
Sounds amazing. We are at the Liberty in Our Lifetime conference, so this sort of begs the question, liberty, right? I mean, if you would ask many people, they might tell you, at least in Western countries, so why the focus on liberty? I mean, we're living in democracies, so there's liberty, no? So clearly, it must be important to you in one way or another that goes maybe beyond what other people think.
Absolutely. I think that our democratic systems as they exist today, and when I say that, I mean the sort of election system, the media that supports that election system, is not really in the business of liberty. It's an infrastructure that is suited to the 20th century, but now we are living in the 21st century. So I think it's very important that people, rather than institutions, are actually thinking about the future that they want to be a part of and that they want to build. And to me, equality and freedom are the core parts of that are in need of attention and most inspiring for people to work on.
Do you have the feeling that this is a growing momentum, let's say even in Western countries, this idea that we need more liberty, that we have to rethink it? Or do you think that it's still more like a minority contemplation?
I think it's growing because I think there are a lot of problems in the world today, such as aging populations, climate change, migration issues that are just not being solved by the institutions that we have today, by your conventional governments, by democratic politics. And so I think the concepts of individual liberty are sort of coming from the fringes, where I would say they were in the 90s and the early 2000s with books like The Sovereign Individual. I think it was a vocal minority at the edges that were most interested in those ideas. But I think the internet has really given fuel to that sense of individualism and to that commitment to liberty and freedom. So I think we're seeing it kind of come much more to the mainstream now. Unfortunately, I think there are some drawbacks to that as well. I think that we've never been as polarized, and there is a kind of tribalism between those who are pro-liberty and those who are pro kind of other ideologies. Despite being here at Liberty in Our Lifetime, I would describe myself as somebody who's quite against most ideologies. I think that ideology, by definition, is the outsourcing of original thinking. And I would like to see more individuals do original thinking rather than outsource to any one ideology. But I do also feel that those in support of liberty are much more inclined to do that original thinking, perhaps, than other groups.
Could you maybe tell us how your organization or your ideas in practice are working in that philosophy that you have?
Absolutely. So Plumia focuses on unlocking global mobility for people everywhere. So fundamentally, me and my team and the community that supports our work believe that less of a person's destiny in the world should be determined by the coincidence of their birthplace. I think that the way that we unlock freedom in the world today, and one of the most impactful and influential ways that we can do that, is by taking away this kind of sense of destiny or burden that is put on somebody by the national passport they end up with, according to who their parents are, or according, as I said, to the coincidence of their birthplace. I believe at the moment that we do not have an equality of opportunity across borders. And if we want more people to be free, we want more people to be able to actually contribute in the world, we need to get rid of that bug in the system as it exists today.
And how do you approach these ideas in a more concrete manner?
So my organization collaborates directly with governments to try and enhance their understanding of, in particular, digital nomads and global citizens, this kind of new framework for thinking about the world. And we have produced a policy paper, which is setting out a new international standard for digital nomad visas. That's sort of our starting point for having a seat around the table to be able to actually speak with governments and influence policy directions that can really impact people's lives. And as I mentioned before, unlock this sense of equality of opportunity that I don't believe exists in the world today because of our sort of outdated institutions, infrastructure, and ideas. So we're really working on that. That's on the think tank side. My think tank is oriented within a larger company called Safety Wing, which is a Y Combinator alumni company, $50 million raised in venture capital. And we are building a global social safety net. So the sort of functionality of a nation state or a citizenship, but delivered as a global borderless digital subscription service. So we have on the market at the moment travel and health insurance products, which work in more than 170 countries worldwide. They travel along with you wherever you go. And next year we will launch a product called Nomad Citizen, which is this global social safety net concept. So going beyond healthcare and into things like unemployment, disability, these kind of welfare instruments that you would conventionally expect from a country. We're making that available by subscription for people who live borderless lives. From there, we are also developing a product called the Nomad Border Pass, which is essentially apply for one digital nomad visa and receive access to multiple countries. So that's the kind of tangible product base that we are working on at the moment. And I'm very lucky to work with colleagues who are motivated to change the world as well as create a good business.
And these products or services are available already?
So the travel and health insurance are available now, and our intended launch date for the other two products that I just mentioned, so that's Nomad Citizen and Nomad Border Pass, is spring, summer next year.
There's also a fundamental question that comes to my mind because I had this discussion today with other participants too. There's an idea floating, let's say, with several of the participants here that is like, we should maybe try to establish new parallel structures that are better than the ones that are provided by, let's say, governments or also failing governments in some cases, and in the end, like replace the available systems by better ones. But the problem, of course, is always like, how do you get from A to B? Because while we still have, in many Western countries at least, you're forced to pay taxes and pay in the social system. So in effect, I have to pay double then, right? That's sort of the problem in between. Do you have some ideas in that regard?
Now, I think the first step has to be to sort of figure out how to evolve existing systems alongside building new systems. My father is a refugee from Iran to the UK, so I've very much grown up with a sense that people actually have to live in the after effects of a revolution, which is why I'm a believer in revolutionary ideas, but an evolutionary approach. So I think, first of all, sort of accepting the status quo that exists at the moment and doing what you can to work with it is very important. At the same time as actually developing the new infrastructure, the better systems that can replace what exists today. I think that to kind of get from A to B, we're going to have a period of time where there's an increased competition between conventional countries and new forces that are sort of providing the services that were once sort of monopolized by countries. I think that's a good thing. I think the outcomes there will be that the optionality and the quality of services available to people will improve. And then I think, maybe in 50 to 100 years, perhaps we will see some of those older kind of structures, like the nation state, like older institutions, sort of retired. But I certainly think that it's a very long-term process, a very long-term project. But, the world that exists in 100 years begins with what we build and the decisions that we make today.
You just said something that I have to contemplate and maybe make the title of the episode revolutionary thinking, but evolutionary approach. Because I had this topic several times in my podcast and different episodes, because I also struggle with the question, how can we get change? And many people say, no, we have to tear things down. But I think the problem really is when you look into history, revolution typically eats its children. And after revolution, more often than not, you have a huge catastrophe that you cannot get together anymore in the end. And then you have some a small number of winners, oligarchs or whatever, who destroy everything. So how to balance revolutionary ideas with change, I think, is a very, very fascinating thing.
I agree. And actually in my keynote today, I spoke about 2 case studies that I can very quickly mention here. But one is the Pirate Bay, the torrenting file sharing website that came about in the early 2000s. I think this is an interesting example of a new technology challenging the status quo, and then the founders of that new technology really suffering the consequences in terms of prison time, extreme fines. And of course, the eventual winner in that space is Spotify. And what Spotify did was actually work with the status quo power holders, in this case, copyright holders, in order to bring essentially the same technology or the same user experience into reality. And I think that's an interesting one to consider in the history of the internet and the history of frontier ideas. And the other is Islamic State. You know, they really are the original internet country in a sense, a movement built online and then manifested offline. And while obviously there were many atrocities, they did in fact build institutions. They minted their own currency. They created their own legal system. They launched their own media. In that case, though, they did not establish legitimacy or diplomatic relations. So actually their ability to provide services to a user were extremely limited, because anything outside of their seized territories, the borders of those territories, they could not provide because they were not recognized by other countries. And I think in both of these cases, they're examples of revolution where ultimately the project fails because they are not paying attention to what's important within the real world that we live in today. It's perhaps a little bit bold to have some kind of lesson to learn or optimistic spin on something like Islamic State, but I actually think it is very important that we look at what has happened in the world and we think about how that applies to the kinds of futures that we want to build and the approach that we take to doing so.
But Islamic State is, I would say, very clearly a failure also from the motives that were driving and from the actual actions that happened. So is this not also a warning how, things can go very wrong?
I mean, I think for many of the proponents of that ideology and those ideas, it was not necessarily a failure in the sense that it is to anyone who does not share those ideologies. I think the bigger warning that I take from it is that any opportunity to build something new, something like an internet country, a free city, a network state, the ideas and values and players that choose to do that can be good or evil. They can be an ideology that promotes peace and a better world for everyone, or they can be an ideology that creates a very dystopian environment or aspires to. I think that's a very important lesson. And one of the reasons that it's actually very important for all people, and your listeners included, to actually think very carefully about the ideas that they're supporting online and offline, and to make sure that they are, not acting in a polarized way, not just being against things, but being for things. I think it's very important to kind of have some utopian thinking. What do we want the world to look like? Not just what are we against? Like, what do we hate? Like, are we pro-Trump or anti-Trump? When you bring things down to that level of tribalism, actually the ideas get lost. It just becomes about slogans. It just becomes about slogans rather than real ideas.
Speaking of slogan, the motto of this conference is from vision to reality. Now, where are we standing? Are we standing in the visionary phase, or are we standing already in reality in one way?
With the ideas that I'm working on, or with free cities?
Whatever you want to answer, both maybe.
I think that we are somewhere between. I think that actually the visions that we are seeing begin to become reality in the world today, you can trace back to often the origins of the internet, actually. A lot of the ideas, even driving the bricks and mortar projects of free cities today, actually do go back to the ideas in books like The Sovereign Individual, the ideas more in MySpace, which is network states, internet countries, can certainly be traced back to the early visions of what the internet could deliver. The idea of more equality and more freedom across borders. We're somewhere in the in-between. I kind of believe in this concept. I think the quote is Oscar Wilde. Utopia is never an end state. It's something that we're moving toward. So actually, I bring that up because I think by the time things become a reality, we've already kind of mentally moved on to the next thing. So actually, we have a new idea of what we are, where we are coming from and the kind of place that we are going to. And so, yeah, I think we have a lot of visions. They can be traced back. A lot of them are beginning to become reality. But actually, by the time we could sit here and say they definitely are reality, we will have a whole new set of ideas that are probably emerging now in subcultures and on the fringes.
Yeah, probably because, society is a dynamically stabilized, complex system in a way. And I think such a system can never have a steady state, right? Things happen that you didn't anticipate and so on. So it's probably our destiny, to change continuously.
Yeah, I think so. I think the whole world is constantly in flux. I think that internet technologies have really accelerated that process and perhaps also accelerated our understanding and knowledge of that process. Certainly, I think humanity by nature is never going to be in an end state, is always striving for something more, something better.
Thank you for taking time for a short conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
So thank you very much, Grant, for taking time for a brief conversation.
Oh, you're welcome. Glad to be here.
Could you maybe introduce yourself briefly?
Sure. My name is Grant Romundt. I'm from Ocean Builders. I've been the CEO, and we have unique way of floating homes on the water.
Before we come to the details of your products and also seasteading, we are at the Liberty in Our Lifetime conference. So I would like to know, why is liberty or aspects of liberty particularly important for you? In the general audience, you might even come up with the question like, but we all live in democracies, so how is liberty still a problem, right? So what is your perspective on that?
Well, I've always loved living on the water because it just had this inherent sense of feeling like you're free. Everything's open, it's open spaces, and it's very calming, and it just has this natural connection to feeling of freedom and liberty, and it's always been a big draw for me. That's kind of been my value. One of my biggest values in my life is freedom. And so my connection to water and freedom seems to be a big part of my life.
Do you have the feeling that this is maybe more broader trend or just like a minority idea of a smaller amount of people?
I think once you experience living on the water, you can get addicted to it. So it may not be a trend yet, but I think it's something that once people experience it, then it's going to really take off. I was originally living in a floating home community in Toronto, Canada, and I didn't know that it even existed until I tried it as an Airbnb, and I fell in love with it. And everyone that came to visit me afterwards fell in love with it. So I think this can grow pretty quickly.
Okay, now we're already in the topic, so to speak. I have to say, I haven't heard the term seasteading until Titus Gebel told it to me in one of the previous podcasts, and I was quite, astonished about this idea. Could you describe the idea of seasteading in general?
Sure. So seasteading is, instead of creating a homestead on land, it's doing the same thing on the water. So the differentiating aspect is that we're on the water. And this was hard to do in the past because living on the water is so different from how we've been living for thousands of years. So we've had to develop a lot of technology to be able to make it viable. So it's been a very slow start because living on a boat is not really how people want to live. The normal people, they might do a boating experience for an experience, but living there is something that takes a lot of refinement to get it to the point where people would accept it as an alternative to living on the land.
But what would then be the difference between seasteading and living on a boat?
Seasteading can give you the same experience of living on land as you have living on land, but you're now on the water. So you have this greater sense of freedom and movement. If you don't like your neighbors, you can move your house to a new location. If you've ever been on a boat, it feels like the walls are tighter, the ceilings are lower. It feels very cramped, restricted, limited. There's a limited amount of water. There's a lot of limitations. So it doesn't have the same freedom as living on a house on land. So with the development we've been doing, we've been developing all the technologies to make it more of a home than a boat.
Could you describe I think you call it Seapod? Mm-hmm. Could you describe the technology a little bit and what you are achieving there?
Sure. So the Seapod looks like something kind of out of the Jetsons, actually, if you know the cartoon, the Jetsons, where you have this kind of a round home. And in the case of the Jetsons, it was floating in the sky. And in our case, it's floating several meters over the water. And it's connected to the water by a small tube, a steel tube. that goes into the water, and the tube goes to a flotation system that's under the waves. And since the flotation is under the waves, it makes it much more stable than a normal boat. So you can have a home on the water that kind of looks like it's defying gravity because it's, floating over the waves, and it has much more stability than most boats. It looks quite futuristic. It turns into a tourist attraction wherever you put them.
We talked about Liberty before. Mm-hmm. So your seaports, are they designed to essentially be in the coastal area, or could you also, because there is, in my understanding, the seasteading idea is also to go beyond the, let's say, influence of nations. Mm-hmm. So could you also establish these seaports further outside in the sea?
So we're developing the technology to make floating homes, and people can take them and put them wherever they want and put them in configurations of larger communities, cities, or other things, and they can put them close to land. All of our seapods are close to land. They're within 3 kilometers of land. If people wanted to put them 20 miles out, they can do that. If they want to put them further out, they can do that. There's some restrictions as to how deep they can put them, depending on how much they want to spend on anchoring, because we are floating, but you still need anchors so they don't just float away. So you don't wake up and you're in China one day. So we have overcome all the technological hurdles to support seasteading. But what we're doing is we're creating the technology for that, and people can, put them wherever they want. But we're focused on putting them close to land where you can have a beautiful home, you can have access to land, and it's a good option for people because they have access to everything that they're used to. But if you go 100 miles out, it's kind of hard to start living out there because it's so far. I feel like if you drop your wrench in the ocean, it's a 4 or 5 hour boat ride to go to the closest hardware store. So starting out there isn't going to be something that's going to be immediate. We need to start close to land, build up a community, and then things will evolve over time.
If I would want to buy such a seaport now, could I go to you and order one?
We do have pre-orders, so you can put a small deposit on just to hold your place in line. It's like $100 deposit maximum. And then when we're ready to go into mass production, where we can bring the cost down, then we'll contact you and say, okay, your order's next, and we can take an actual deposit. Right now, we haven't taken actual deposits yet because we still have to bring the cost down to a reasonable level that would be a reasonable price point. Right now, we've just developed the technology to the point of being a prototype, and prototypes are always quite a bit more expensive.
And what price point would you want to achieve? At what price point would you think that you can find customers who are interested in that?
The initial units will be in the $1.2 to $1.5 million range. And that would be for a really high-end luxury floating home, which compares very nicely to any beachfront property that you would want to buy anywhere. And it would have its own power, its own water. And so it would be very independent for home and would last very, very long time. So it would be pretty good bargain compared to buying a beachfront property anywhere in the world, actually.
Now, let's talk a bit about the future. Do you see already, interests in coastal communities who would like to extend their community to the sea? Or also the second question would be, because you were at the panel before, and that there was the discussion of, for instance, offshore fisheries or fish farms. Are there maybe also industrial applications in that sense, like fish farming, something like that, that would open new opportunities for such type of setups?
There's lots of countries around the world that have approached us that are interested in having these as a new way of living or a tourist attraction. And they want to do something that's innovative. And this is very innovative. I think this could be like a new version of Venice. People travel from all over the world to see Venice in Italy. It's just it's a beautiful place. It's kind of captures people's imagination, and they dream of always going there. So we think that a new version of Venice can be built. And we have some really, really cool ideas on how to do that I think people would add it to their wish list of places that they want to go.
Thank you very much for the conversation.
Okay, you're welcome. Thank you.
Peter, thank you very much for taking time for a short conversation.
Very pleased to be here, Alexander.
Maybe you could introduce yourself shortly.
So I'm Peter. I'm the Managing Director of the Free Cities Foundation, and we're a not-for-profit organisation that focuses on promoting self-governing territories that promote individual rights and freedoms. So these are parts of countries that have some degree of autonomy and are using it to create a system that upholds voluntarism and free exchange.
We are at the Liberty in Our Lifetimes conference, and that begs the question, liberty. So why is liberty important for you, or aspects of liberty maybe? And also because in the general public, people might be of the opinion, well, we are in Western democracies, we have freedom anyway. So what is we're talking about here?
Well, liberty is really being able to realize your full potential. And although we may feel like we can do what we want in certain respects, what we can do is limited by the resources we can draw on. Having a lack of liberty in a lot of areas can result in certain things that we want to achieve not being achievable. So everyone needs a place to live, for example. If you heavily restrict the housing sector so that it becomes very expensive and very difficult to build, then house prices go up really high and you have to spend a large proportion of your income on rent or on your mortgage repayments. And that restricts the liberty you can have to pursue other kinds of ends that you might have in your life. So one of the things that we might experience in Western countries is their rising costs of living, rising house prices. To me, liberty is being able to remove some of the barriers that are causing those things to be really expensive so that we can focus on more meaningful pursuits, so that we can have more free time. We don't have to spend quite as many hours just working and toiling in order to provide the necessities. We can start to orient ourselves towards more meaningful activities. So for me, free cities and liberty is a kind of way that we can start to do that.
Do you have the feeling that the aim for more liberty is a rising topic in general population, or is it more like let's say, a minority desire?
My feeling of the situation is that generally the majority of people are shifting gradually towards the left wing, or you might call, in that's gradually towards the idea that the state should be solving more problems. I mean, I'm talking really about Western countries, to be honest. But if you talk about the sort of period in history that we're in, we've had a good few decades of living in peaceful countries where living standards have gradually risen. We haven't had that many major global wars since the Second World War that have, comparative to historical standards in terms of number of deaths. I think there's a sense that people have become quite comfortable and they've started to become really divorced from the things that create the wealth that we're currently enjoying. And that's leading to a general rise in statist views. But in reaction to that, there is a rise in libertarianism that I do feel is growing. And we see that in our own movement. When we first ran this conference in 2021, it was quite a niche event and we had about 7 projects and 150 people. We're now at an event which has more than twice as many people and more than almost 4 times the number of projects. So there's definitely a sense that people are wanting some sort of change in a libertarian direction. And there's definitely a sense that that kind of core group of libertarian people are becoming more coordinated, more knowledgeable about each other. Although when you look at the way that elections are going, or what political parties tend to offer as their policies, although that seems to be becoming more in the direction of state interventionism, the core kind of libertarian group, I feel that's also growing as well.
But at the same time, it appears when you look at many countries in Europe, but also the US, that despite the fact that state interventionism is increasing or is constantly increasing over the last decades, it doesn't appear to solve the problems actually. The problems seem to become greater and greater. That's
very true, yes. We've seen a lot of increase in interventions in the economy over the last 5 years in particular, particularly in response to the COVID-19 virus. And like in the UK, people were being paid by the government to stay at home, and we had very high levels of inflation. As a result, now we're having to introduce all kinds of additional interventions, additional subsidies for people in order to correct these problems. I think it's what Ludwig von Mises writes about in his book, Bureaucracy, where he describes that interventionism begets even more interventionism in the economy. And we're definitely seeing that. We've been electing interventionist governments in Western countries for decades, and it doesn't seem like the core things that people want, the price of housing, the access to healthcare in terms of how long you have to wait to be seen by a doctor, the quality of education where you're in schools where the other children are well behaved and not disruptive. It doesn't seem like those things are going in a positive direction. So one has to, at some point, question whether our premise that the government coming in and solving everything is correct, or whether actually starting from first principles and handing over some of these areas to the free market might be more effective.
Now this might be a segue to the Free Cities Foundations, right? So maybe you could give us an idea what this foundation was founded for and what the purpose is.
Well, the Free Cities Foundation is founded in order to promote innovation in governance, particularly in the direction of more free market governance models. Basically, the premise is that we live in a world with 195 different countries. Sounds like quite a big number. But when you actually look at how those countries govern themselves, whether it's how they raise money. So the vast majority of countries raise money through taxes. They don't have like fees where people say, I'm going to be part of this state. I'm going to pay $1,000 a year and that's my membership fee. And then I can have healthcare if I want it for an extra fee, or education for another fee. We just have this system where you pay taxes based on what you earn and your economic activity. And then what you get from the state is basically the same. That's basically the same everywhere in the world. Another thing that's basically the same is that we have the same kind of money. Not all countries, but the vast majority of countries have a central bank that issues a currency that they solely have the ability to issue, a monopoly issuer. It's an inflationary currency, meaning the supply goes up every single year. There's not really a country that operates on a hard money standard, or a standard of money that's not controlled by some government. So you've got some countries like El Salvador that operate on the US dollar, but there's another government that controls the supply, and it's an inflationary supply. There's also a lot of commonalities in how leaders are elected, through majoritarian elections that we call democratic, but actually, is it democratic in the sort of original Greek meaning of the term, meaning rule of the people? Is it really democratic for minorities to have their opinion overruled by majorities? And there's a question of how you really put the dividing lines in place. How do you define a democratic process? Should it be over 100,000 people, 1 million people, 10 million people? That's the kind of open philosophical question. So to get to the point of what the Free Cities Foundation aims to do, we're an organization that believes that these core areas that cities have in common, or governments have in common, are ripe for innovation. There's not that many choices to people, and we believe that the world is better when people can choose different kinds of governance system to live within. Because if you look compared to any other sector, whether it's like mobile phones or the computer you buy or the food you buy in the shop, there's a variety of different choice, and we think that that's a good thing, and that drives up standards. In sectors like electronics and in food, standards go up and up and up because there's a relatively free market in those sectors. Whereas in sectors like healthcare and education, standards are not necessarily going up because they tend to be quite controlled by the government and regulated by the government. Let me rephrase that. It might be that they're becoming more expensive rather than standards that aren't going up. The point with free cities is that they allow that kind of innovation. They allow people to come up with new governance systems that are offering an alternative to that status quo. And that's the thing that motivates us to do our work.
You brought up a point that I find very interesting, the point of scaling, like how many people should decide about certain things.
Yeah.
And I find this is a very interesting thing when you think about the size of cities. When you look into the history of mankind, countries change territory all the time, but hardly any city ever disappeared, so to speak. Most cities had quite a continuity over millennia even. So that would beg the question, is the city maybe quite a good scale for governance and also for innovation, all of that things?
I think so, yeah. I mean, if you look at, it's a unit of societal organization that makes sense. That's a very astute observation. Once cities exist, they don't tend to fall away into nothing, do they? You do get new cities that emerge due to certain historical phenomenon, like the emergence of Hong Kong, for example, or the emergence of Singapore. They emerge because of unique political circumstances where a certain area ended up under a different governing body. And Hong Kong was very successful in that regard. But yes, you're right that there haven't been that many examples historically of cities that have just fallen away. For that reason, yeah, they could be a good unit of societal organization.
The conference is over, at least the main part is over. What was your impression about the conference? What were the lessons that you could learn?
I think the lesson I've learned is that the desire to live in a system where people are free to exchange with each other, sharing ideas, sharing their time, working constructively on projects, unimpeded by some central authority that tells them that they shouldn't be doing X, Y, or Z, is universal. If you came to our first conference, you would have seen like a smattering of projects across maybe 2 or 3 continents. And in this year, we've got projects across 6 different continents. It doesn't matter whether you're in Latin America, Europe, Africa, Asia, there's a desire everywhere for freer kinds of governance. Although the movement is quite young, we've also seen some practical examples of how it will work. Like we've heard about how in Ciudad Morazan, they're starting to develop their own systems for arbitrating in disputes. They've got their own private police force that's replacing the kind of state police, and it's working really well. So the lessons are, if you just give people a bit of autonomy, they can do really amazing things within quite a short period of time. But if the government steps in and tries to intervene, then they can do a lot of damage to that. I think the more of these projects there are, the more that we're seeing actually there's potentially a really good thing here. The other lesson is, particularly when we think about what's happened in Honduras with the zones for employment and economic development that have had a lot of opposition from the national government, we've seen there that the opposition can be very damaging. And at the moment, there are some battles going on that are being fought very fiercely. So I think the lesson is, if you leave people to try out new things, you can see great successes, but don't expect it to be easy in terms of how you're opposed.
This is something that impressed me at the conference. I mean, there are a lot of different ideas, and I have to say I'm not on board with every idea so here. Yeah. But for me, I liked very much what Tom Sowell said about how we should approach complex systems. It's more about the how, not so much about the what. And what I liked very much is the enormous amount of different experiments and trying out things. I have the feeling that we lost this to a significant extent in our societies. And why not just let people try out things, right? And then figure out what works, what does not work.
Well, that's exactly what we argue you should do. And I think we live in a society that is quite prescriptive and regulated often. There's often guidance on various things and regulations on various things. And that creates a culture where people tend to just kind of copy the regulations rather than thinking outside of the box. Free cities are a forum where people can think outside of the box and can solve problems in a free entrepreneurial way, as long as they're not harming other people. So it's a very simple principle that lies at the heart of the Free Cities projects. It's that you're free to form networks, develop relationships, do business, as long as you're not harming the rights of another person. And it's a very simple idea, and I think it's shown in practice that that can be very effective.
One last question. The motto of the conference was from vision to reality.
Yes.
Now, where are we? Are we still mostly in the vision phase, or are we already in the phase of reality?
We're still quite early in the movement, but we have got definitely some realities to share. There are a reality of the scale of dozens of people living. So Ciudad Morazan, one of the ZAs in Honduras, has got about 100 people living there. Similarly with Prospera, they've just developed a new building called the Junior Residences. They're starting to get their first residents in. They've got a few hundred businesses registered and are welcoming their first residents. So there are examples of projects out there that have actually got political autonomy, and they have got residents, and they have got businesses. And you know, in Prospera, for example, they have some really innovative sectors. They've got some really cool stuff going on with cell and gene therapy. They've got some stuff going on with drone technology. They've got various companies that are outsourcing operations there in sectors like real estate sector. Real business is being done, and it's not just limited to like a small number of sectors. It's diverse, it's high value, and there is a reality. But I'd say the mixture of like projects we've seen at the conference is sort of centered on, you've got about maybe 40% that are really tangible people living there, and 60% where they've kind of been inspired recently by this movement, and they're starting their own things, and they're probably looking towards accepting residents in the next 1, 2, 3 years.
Thanks so much for your time, and good luck for your projects.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Really pleased to talk to you today.
Thank you very much for listening to the impressions of the Liberty in our Lifetime Conference 2024. It was a very interesting, inspiring event for me, and I hope you could take home some new ideas and thoughts for yourself. Please subscribe to the podcast if you like it and share it with others. So I wish you a good morning, a great day, and a relaxing evening whenever you are listening. Hear you soon.